I want you to pause for a moment and picture this. A vast island of ice and silence. Almost no people. But suddenly, at the center of a global storm, when the White House says the US military is always an option for Greenland, this is no longer about geography. It is about power. And whether rules still matter, when power speaks loudly enough, Greenland belongs to Denmark. That fact is not disputed. And yet, the conversation has shifted from diplomacy to possibility, from law to leverage. From Shanghai, the Irish Prime Minister calls for common sense. Europe rallies behind Denmark. NATO is mentioned not as a shield, but as a fragile promise. I am not here to provoke outrage. I am here to ask a harder question. What happens to the world order when acquisition is discussed the way markets discuss assets? If this kind of logic unsettles you, stay with me. Because to understand this moment, we first need to understand what is really being argued and what is quietly being rewritten. Good. Let's slow this down and put structure around the noise. At its core, this is not a debate about Greenland's ice, or its size, or even its military value. It is a debate about how power justifies itself in the 21st century. On one side, the United States frames Greenland as a security necessity, a strategic asset in the Arctic, a place where military presence already exists and could be expanded. On the other side, Denmark, the European Union, and multiple NATO allies insist on a simpler principle. Sovereignty is not negotiable. Territory is not a bargaining chip. Borders are not optional. Ireland's intervention matters precisely because it strips away the drama. Common sense, Michel Martin says. In other words, we already have mechanisms, we already have alliances, we already have rules. And yet, the very fact that force is publicly mentioned tells us something deeper. It tells us the argument is no longer just legal. It is systemic. To see why this tension exists at all, we need to step back and look at how Greenland ended up at the crossroads of history in the first place. To understand why Greenland is even part of this conversation, we need to widen the lens. Greenland is the world's largest island. It governs itself. It has its own parliament, but it remains part of the Kingdom of Denmark. Geographically, it sits in North America. Politically and culturally, it has long been tied to Europe. That ambiguity is not accidental. It is historical. For decades, Greenland has occupied a quiet role in global security. The United States has maintained a military base there for years. During the Cold War, it was a listening post, a strategic outpost, a silent piece of the Arctic balance. That arrangement worked because it respected a system. American security interests were met, Danish sovereignty was preserved, and NATO functioned as the framework holding it together. What has changed is not Greenland itself. What has changed is the global cycle we are entering. As institutions weaken and competition sharpens, strategic locations stop being shared responsibilities and start being reclassified as assets. And that shift sets the stage for the first real rupture. The rupture arrives the moment language changes. When the White House says the US military is always an option, it crosses a line that alliances are built to prevent. Not because an invasion is planned, but because the idea of force is normalized. European leaders react quickly. A joint statement follows. Not emotional, not theatrical, just firm. Greenland belongs to its people. Only Denmark and Greenland can decide their relationship. Security in the Arctic must be pursued collectively through NATO. This is the first mini crisis, not a clash of armies, but a clash of principles. Because NATO is not just a military alliance. It is a promise that power will be restrained by consent. And here is the danger. If one NATO member signals that sovereignty can be overridden for security reasons, the entire structure begins to wobble. Ireland's response captures this anxiety perfectly. Greenland is Danish. The military base can be discussed, but territorial integrity is not up for debate. That distinction matters more than it seems. because once sovereignty becomes conditional, it rarely stops with one island. And that brings us to the deeper mechanism at work beneath this moment. What we are really witnessing is not a dispute over land. It is the exposure of a mechanism that has been quietly reshaping global politics. For decades, the international system relied on institutions to manage power, the United Nations to legitimize it, NATO to discipline it, diplomacy to soften it. But that system only works when authority is respected. Ireland's Prime Minister says the authority of the UN has been eroded. That is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a diagnosis. When rules lose weight, power fills the vacuum. Security arguments replace legal ones. And options begin to include things that were once unthinkable. Notice how carefully the language is framed. No invasion is planned. Buying the island is mentioned instead. Force is not threatened, but it is left on the table. This ambiguity is the mechanism. It creates leverage without commitment, pressure without accountability, and it forces smaller states into a defensive posture, constantly reaffirming principles that used to be assumed. Greenland becomes symbolic not because of what it is, but because of what it reveals. A world where the line between negotiation and coercion is no longer clearly drawn, and that uncertainty is about to produce a second, more human crisis. Now, let me bring this closer to you, because when global power shifts, it never stays abstract for long. Imagine living in a place that suddenly becomes strategic, not because you changed, but because the world did. Greenland's people did not ask to become a security debate. They did not vote to be a bargaining chip between capitals thousands of miles away. And yet, decisions about their future are now discussed in press briefings, joint statements, and classified rooms. This is what geopolitical tension feels like on the ground. Uncertainty, silence, a sense that your home is being spoken about, but not spoken with. When leaders talk about sovereignty, they are really talking about dignity, about whether people are subjects or stakeholders. And this is where common sense becomes more than a phrase. It becomes a demand. If you believe that security should not come at the cost of consent, this moment matters to you. If you believe power must still answer to principle, you are already part of this story. Stay with me, because what happens in Greenland does not stop at its shores. What begins at the edge of the Arctic never stays there, because Greenland sits inside a web of alliances, treaties, and expectations that stretch far beyond Europe. If the United States can openly discuss acquiring territory from an ally, even hypothetically, every alliance recalculates. Trust becomes conditional. Commitments feel less permanent. European leaders understand this immediately. That is why the response is collective, not national. Not Denmark alone, but the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Spain. The message is subtle but firm. Security must be shared, or it will fracture. NATO was designed to prevent power from being used unilaterally inside the alliance. The moment that norm weakens, the alliance shifts from a guarantee into a question mark. And beyond Europe, others are watching closely. If sovereignty is flexible for Greenland, why not elsewhere? If borders are negotiable for security, who decides when security applies? This is how precedents travel quietly, quickly, and often irreversibly. The Arctic may look remote on a map, but in strategic terms, it is now a mirror reflecting the future shape of global order. And that brings us to what comes next. From this moment forward, the future splits not into certainty, but into scenarios. The first is the best case path. Language cools. Diplomacy regains control. Security concerns are addressed through NATO, not over it. Greenland remains Danish, autonomous, respected, and the episode becomes a warning, not a turning point. The second is the middle path. The rhetoric never fully disappears. Options remain on the table. Pressure replaces dialogue. Nothing breaks, but nothing heals either. Allies grow cautious. trust thins slowly, almost invisibly. Then there is the worst-case scenario. Not invasion, but normalization. The idea that territory can be discussed like a transaction. That sovereignty bends when power insists. That institutions exist, but no longer constrain. This is how systems fail. Not with collapse, but with precedent. Ireland's call for common sense is, in this light, a call for memory. A reminder that order is not natural, it is maintained. And whether this system holds will depend on one final choice. Do we treat rules as obstacles, or as the last technology humanity invented to survive power itself? Let me leave you with this. Greenland is not the story. It is the signal, a signal that the world is testing how far power can stretch before principles stare. A signal that institutions only work if leaders choose to respect them. A signal that common sense is no longer common. It has to be defended. When an ally speaks of military options against another ally, even hypothetically, the damage is already done. Because norms don't collapse when they are violated. They collapse when they are spoken about casually. This moment will not be remembered for what happened. It will be remembered for what was considered acceptable to say. And that is why this matters to you. Because every time rules weaken at the top, instability travels downward into markets, borders, and lives far removed from the original decision. If you want to understand where the global order is heading, don't just watch the headlines. Watch the language. That's where the future leaks out first. If this analysis helped you see the system more clearly, stay with me. Subscribe, share this conversation, because the next crisis won't announce itself as loudly, and by then, the rules may already be optional.